This is my third generation flight simulator. I've started building flight sims around 2004, all based around the Microsoft Flight Simulator various versions. I have now the basement light on, so you can show you a little bit of the arrangement. You can see a wooden table that I've built myself, which includes my other home computer and some other stuff. For seats, I'm using this Jeep Cherokee right-hand side front seat that I got on eBay. It's nice because it includes electric controls that allow you to position yourself as comfortable as you want. Attached to the seat via some metal brackets are a couple of GoFlight metal rudder pedals. These are the best rudder pedals, I think, that were ever built for the hobbyist market. I'm not sure they're available anymore, but they're very sturdy and have, of course, integral toe brakes. For controls, I have a combination of a touch-sensitive ViewSonic monitor. I'll show you how it works in a minute, as well as a series of GoFlight hardware modules, an autopilot module, some knob modules, pitch, gear control, flaps. These are the lights for the gear, as well as some buttons that I've built myself. A typical twin throttle quadrant, throttles, props, and mixtures. I don't use yokes. I don't like the yokes available for home simulators. So I have a Cytec Cyborg USB stick. I think it's the best stick you can have because you can use it with your left hand. Most sticks for the home hobbyist market are geared towards games like jet fighters. So they're all geared for a right hand, and they're very awkward to use with your left hand. I used to have a triple monitor system that died. So now I have simply a large front monitor, which of course, since my main hobby is instrument flying, I don't use very often. And I have another side monitor that I use either as an out-the-window display, or in this case, I have the spot plane view. So I'll show you how to start this engine. Okay, here we are ready to try a flight. Most of the most of the instruments are on these touch-sensitive ViewSonic panel. Sometimes one item covers another one. For instance, I have the Garmin 530 partially on top of the main panel. If I select the main panel by touching it, then the full panel shows up. If I select the 530, it selects it. And it's relatively easy to toggle the switches. You simply push, for instance, the battery switch, and the battery comes on, and there's the voltage coming up to 28 volts. So for instance, to start, I make sure that I have the parking brake on, which is on this button here. So parking brake is on. I move the mixtures up with the quadrant, but also the image moves up. And I have the fuel on the main tanks. I'm going to put both the strobe and the beacon lights on. Here are the lights coming on. And I'm going to start the left engine. And there we go. And it's a good throttle, and we have oil pressure coming up. And we're going to turn the left alternator on, left alternator charging. Same thing for the right engine. And there's the engine starting. And here's the right engine pressure. I'm going to turn the engine volume down a little bit now that we've started the engines. That's better. And the right alternator on, and the right alternator is charging, and the load is balanced. So I'm ready to turn the avionics on. That turns on the Garmin. I have to turn the transponder on by hand. I don't know why. And this goes through the standard Garmin 530 startup sequence. I can touch any of these buttons to press them, but in order to turn the knobs, I have assigned these two knobs to these two hard knobs on the GoFlight panel. And I also have three buttons that repeat the push for cursor, enter, and clear. For instance, in order to clear the OK, I can either push the enter button here or the hardware button here. I'm going to press the touch sensitive, and here we are. It goes through a mock-up GPS startup. When you buy this Reality XP GPS, it's personalized for you. So this message shows up at the beginning saying it's licensed to me. So let me set up a flight plan. And now I'm going to use the hardware button to push the cursor, and because it's right next to the knobs. And I'm going to have a kilo KOKV. Let's go to Winchester, which is a very familiar practice airport for us that fly around Leesburg for real. That's OKV. Oops, I was going to enter OVK. So OK, and here's the V, Winchester. So enter, and I'm going to select the procedure, select an approach procedure. It's going to be the ILS 32, fine. And I'm going to go for the JSON transition. Enter, and I'm going to activate it. Enter. So here we are, and yes, GPS guidance for monitor only. That's the lawyers that make them put that ad, so we don't sue them if we crash the airplane while using the Garmin 530. So here we are. Let's assume we've been released and we have the right transponder setting. On the Garmin 330 or 337, I like to use the timer on the transponder. So I'm going to put it to count up. So now I have a stopwatch on the ready here. Let's preset the flight control system. My initial heading to JSON is 278, so I'm going to put 278 on both the heading bug, 278, as well as the OBS, although it should, as soon as I start navigating, it should go to 278 on its own, and you can see that the numbers are also repeated on the Go Flight hardware panel. I'm going to set the desired altitude, target altitude to 3,700, which is, by the way, the transition segment between JSON and CLAD, and I'm going to be ready to climb at a 700 feet per minute. So I'm assuming I've done my pre-takeoff checklist, but I have fuel pumps on low and fuels on main, and the trim. Let's take a quick peek at the trim. Pitch trim seems neutral, rudder and aileron on trim are centered. So let's assume we've been given a release and our transponder is 0157. So let me now change the left window view from the spot aircraft, which is nice to see the airplane starting. Now I'm going to go to a cockpit view, but I'm going to select on this view options, that for that cockpit I want to see a forward left view, which is more or less a little bit to my left. So let's get this road on the show, as Victor Fleming would say. Let's release the parking brake. By the way, I have to be careful because next to the parking brake I have two hardware buttons that will cause the left or right engine to fail. That's how I can have somebody sitting next to me induce engine failures at random on me. Okay, clear on final, even though it's a pretty crummy IMC day. I think visibility is about a mile and we have about 500-foot ceiling or something like that. So here we go. Manifold pressure coming up. Fuel flow is normal. Airspeed's alive. $80, 85, rotate. No more runway, gear is coming up. When I return my hand after raising the gear, I don't put my hands on the throttles anymore. I put them on the props, because I know if I have an engine failure, what I want to do is secure the engine fast, but hopefully that will not happen to me, not today. About 1,000 feet altitude. I'm at blue line. Let me speed up a little bit, reduce manifold pressure a little bit, reduce RPMs to a comfortable level. Once the RPMs are set, I'm going to hit the prop sync. So prop sync. And now let's navigate to our first flight plan. Let me go to GPS and let's go direct to JSON, enter, enter. And that's a desired track off. Let's go to number 1 nav. Let me hit the clear button a couple of times because this thing is kind of clear. There we go. 629, so let me turn left to heading of 629. I'm looking for 3,700 feet, but wait a minute. Why not just let the autopilot do it? So I'm gonna set altitude, hold, heading, and set the autopilot on. There we go. Here's the flight director. Ah, we've broken on top of the overcast. So we're gonna go to 700 feet per minute climb rate. So it's going a little higher than that. It will trim back down. If we were looking at the trim wheel, we would see it. There you go, the trim wheel is moving. And oh, I forgot to get my ForeFlight panel. So let me push the pause button and let me go get my ForeFlight. Here we are again. I turn on my ForeFlight. Let me unpause the sim. And here we are. We've departed Leesburg and we are going to be on our way to KOKV. Let me get the approach in there. OKV, procedures, approach, ILS runway 32, and let me put it on the map. The ability to drive the ForeFlight with the Microsoft Flight Simulator is really useful. This thing says oh, I think I touched something here. This thing tells me we're not really going to Jason. Ah, I know why. Because I'm following a heading and I'm a little bit off the course. So if I now hit nav on the autopilot, it will bank left, and now it will head towards Jason. And the 530 tells me that we are 10.9 miles from Jason, and it's going to take us 4 minutes and 14 seconds. We're still climbing. I'm going to wait until we get to altitude, and then I'm going to speed up the sim. I don't speed up the sim while climbing an autopilot because that destabilizes the autopilot a little bit and you end up hunting on altitude. But as soon as we get to 3,700, I'm going to really accelerate towards Jason. Let me increase the range on the 530. There's Jason, and I have ForeFlight on map mode, so it's north up instead of aircraft heading up. The simulator paused because I touched the touch-sensitive screen with the iPad. Me bad. Okay, we're at 3,700 and the altitude is stabilized. So I'm going to use these buttons here to increase the rate of simulator. Now I'm going at 4x speed. And indeed, I'm going really fast. Look at the time going down. Now it's 2 minutes. Now at Jason, we'll take a slight left turn towards Clad, and the approach procedure says that from Jason, as an IAF, oops, look how fast I'm going in, I better put the simulator back into normal speed, 2x and 1x normal speed. It's a no procedure turn from Jason to Clad, so when I reach Clad, it will turn right to the inbound heading of 324. And let's brief the approach. It's 3,700 until Clad. And then we could either descend to 3,100, or what I'd rather do, and I know I can do it here, is if I have a glide slope, I will capture the glide slope at altitude. If you have the glide slope, you can do that. If you don't have it, you're supposed to descend to 3,100. So here we are approaching Jason. Let me reduce the range a little bit. And in 10 seconds, we'll turn left to 242. In the meanwhile, let me check the frequency for the localizer is 109.55. It's ready. The Garmin 530 is supposed to switch to the V-Lock from GPS if you haven't done it yet, and also switch frequencies, but I'm not going to wait for it to do it. I'm going to flip the frequencies. And let's continue on the approach briefing. Once we capture the glide slope, we'll intercept the final approach fix for the non-precision version of this approach at Kogan, which is 5.6 miles from the runway. At that point, we should be at 2,200. The minimum descent altitude is 915, which corresponds to a decision height. Sorry, the decision altitude is 915, which corresponds to the decision height of 200. And the missed approach is climbing straight ahead to 1,400, then climbing right turn to 3,000 700 via heading 160 to intercept the outbound localizer back to clad intersection and hold at 3,700. We are now 3 miles from clad, 56 seconds to go, and I'm going really fast, full blast, 170 knots, so I better reduce power. On my Cessna 310, the magical power is 21 inches. On this one, this Baron that's on the flight simulator, I've noticed that 20 inches about right, and I'm also going to put in 1 notch of flaps or approach flaps, which on the Baron are signaled by a blue light. So here I am. You can see on the 530 the turn anticipation, the little dash magenta line, and it's turning ahead of clad, and that's the nice turn that will fare us into the final approach heading. Meanwhile, the course deviation indicator has slewed to the approach heading of 324. That is nice. And again, the nav flag is showing red because on this particular installation, that flag signals the presence of a VHF nav system, and the GPS is not VHF, so it says, hey, I don't have VHF nav. But we know better. Anyway, as we fare into the final approach course, I can now flip the CDI from GPS to VHF or localizer, VLOC. As you can see, the nav flag has disappeared, and we are slightly below the glide slope, but approaching the glide slope. I'm going to reduce the power a little bit because I'd like to be at about 120. And I'm going to move the heading bug to the final approach score of 324. I can do it either looking at the instrument or looking at the numeric display. Half a dot to go, 120 knots, maybe a tad faster. And we're in gear speed and approach flaps. And let me make sure I have approach mode on the autopilot. And we know we are in approach mode because the altitude and heading lights have disappeared. We have captured the glide slope. This particular installation does not have a glide slope capture indicator itself, but you can see that it's starting to descend and we're following the glide slope. I probably should have started a timer of some sort, although the times here are from the final approach fix, so let's reset that timer and we'll start the timer at the final approach fix, which is Kogan. Again, decision altitude is 915 and we are above the overcast. That's a disappointment. I was hoping for some worse weather here. Let's do that. Let me pause the sim in the middle of the approach and let me make the weather a little bit worse than it is. A little bit better. Still some breaks in the overcast. So we are slightly above the glide slope, but we're recovering. You see our descent rate is about 750 feet per minute. I think the glide slope is approaching. We're a little bit fast, so let me further reduce the manifold pressure. This is a very slippery Baron here. I'm checking on the ForeFlight, and we are on the localizer. It's too bad that we can't have an airplane symbol on the profile view on the approach plate, but I guess it's asking a little bit too much. I'm not sure if the data on the plate is such that you could do a vertical profile. So let me still further reduce the manifold pressure. We have 3 greens, we have 1 notch of flaps. Now we are exactly on glide slope and localizer, and we are 10 seconds from Kogan, the final approach fix that we should hit at 2,200 feet, and indeed we're getting close to 2,200. 2 seconds, 1 second, Kogan, start a timer, and guess what, 2,200 feet. So we should be entering the crud here, hopefully a little visibility. And the airspeed, 120 knots, is just right. Oh, now we're in the middle of the overcast. It was thicker than it seemed from above. That's one of the failures of the weather model on Microsoft Flight Simulator, at least version 9, which is the one I'm using. We're 1,000 feet above the decision altitude of 915 feet, 120 knots, maybe slowing a little bit, so let me add just a wee bit of manifold pressure. But we are within a quarter of a dot of the glide slope. Our autopilot's wonderful. I like flying on autopilot and then simulating an autopilot failure and taking over, because that is the way I'm going to really fly. I will not launch single pilot IFR in real IMC unless I have a working autopilot. You got more than enough workload if something goes wrong. It is reasonable to start the flight with a low workload. So to me, a working autopilot is a dispatch mandatory item, minimum necessary equipment. I don't have an MEL, but if I did, I would. We're 500 feet above, 53 seconds from runway 32 reference waypoint. Again, I'm looking for 915 on the altitude, 120 knots on glide slope, on localizer. And we got 3 greens, that's my second check, and 1 notch of flaps. 1,115, we're 200 feet above. There's a little bit of ground contact, but it's raining hard. Now we're 100 feet above, getting close to minima, and I have some approach lights. And minima, you see the runway continue, autopilot off, full flaps. And look for the far end of the runway. Power is coming back. And braking. And that, children, it's how it's done. Cheated death once again.